the Biology of Depression series by Melodie Dupuis, and the first is Biology of Depression. There are psychological depressions and then clinical depressions. The psychological depression is the result of an emotional trauma, while the clinical depression is an imbalance of hormones. Both have emotional, social, physical, and sometimes financial consequences. The lack of emotional energy that looks like a constant sadness is not always apparent. The social challenges that come with low emotional and physical energy are very evident. It may lead to isolation, which is the worst situation a depressed person needs. In some cases, the isolation for depressed persons looks more like they surround themselves with chaotic social energy to provide them relief from having to be emotionally present. The physical symptoms can be very serious when there is a chronic lack of emotional and physical energy. In some cases, deadly diseases will result, or an emotional void from feeling hopeless can result in suicide. The financial cost is evident when depressed persons can't provide for their basic needs because of the emotional, physical, social, and financial challenges that they have to deal with on a daily basis. Psychological depression is usually caused by trauma. Trauma creates a vulnerability in the brain because the emotional systems of the brain found at the base of the skull and the thinking systems of the brain, or the frontal area, are not connecting efficiently or consistently. If the trauma is long-term, there is a danger that the brain will develop a deregulation of brain waves, and then mental illness, as we know it, will occur. Everybody will experience trauma, and it is important for the brain to process trauma. The brain is then forced to manage strong feelings, which is working hard to reconnect and balance the thinking and emotional systems of the brain. It is when individuals are not able to process trauma successfully that mental illnesses may result. Clinical depression usually begins to show signs during a developmental hormonal surge and is usually identified around 17 to 21 years of age. The understanding is that this mental illness is genetically predisposed and results in a DSM-5 diagnosis by a psychiatrist. But currently, we are reporting children for the first time showing signs of mental illness and tragically dying by suicide. Some disorders, like autism, is a reality that is unique. It may have a huge spectrum, but it is a neurological disorder that we have not yet found the cause, let alone the cure. Scientists do agree, though, that the environment plays a significant role in children born with an autistic spectrum disorder. When I say environment, I'm talking about epigenetics. Epigenetics is the science that tries to understand how genes are turned on or off through the environmental events. To explain this better, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and the oncologist believed that I had developed cancer because of the emotional stress I had experienced when I had to charge another professional with unethical and unprofessional behavior. I had the predisposition to cancer because my mother and my paternal grandmother died of colon cancer. It was the emotional trauma of dealing with the unethical and unprofessional colleague that was the trigger to turn on my gene for cancer. This may be an oversimplification of the science, but it is just easier to understand when explained this concretely. Unfortunately, in our culture, we stereotype individuals with mental illness. It is the effect of giant pharmaceutical companies using the media to solicit support in their bid for economics? Good question. Most individuals who have sustained a traumatic event will experience depression, and this is a predictable and natural function of dealing with strong emotions. What is not natural is the brain's inability to manage the strong feelings and process the aftermath from trauma. Pharmaceuticals are not the ideal first line of defense. They are cheaper at first, but not in the long run. The brain is a miraculous organ, and retraining the brain is scientifically a reality today. Again, the alternatives for help when dealing with strong emotions is professional counseling or therapy if needed. But it is important to note here that peer support, whether it is friends, family, or trained supporters, usually determine the success of the recovery. Every human being needs other human beings because we are hardwired to belong to each other. Most Canadians can't afford competent and experienced professionals at a low cost, In the Canadian medical system, the psychiatrist will diagnose and prescribe pharmaceuticals. The counselor or psychologist will provide the treatment plan. This sounds so matter-of-fact, when in reality it is far from it. I believe the majority of Canadians, 80%, have needed counseling but were unable to access the resources they could afford, which are essential in managing traumatic events. We know from the cultural studies and personal experiences that mental health and physical well-being are one and the same. Yet we don't believe it because we still behave as though mental health is a separate entity from the physical body. Knowing something doesn't automatically translate into believing. This is the conundrum that we face every day. Resilience is an inherent part of being in the animal kingdom. Our brains can be very elastic and have the capacity to manage trauma with the help of family, friends, and professionals if need be. When the brain believes, the brain will act. When the brain knows something, it is not predictable if the brain is ready to believe or not. Therefore, a guarantee of acting on this knowledge is unpredictable. It is understandable when you realize that everything is filtered through the emotional complex systems of the brain before it travels to the thinking systems of the brain. Until the brain believes the information it is receiving, only then will it send it to the thinking systems of the brain to either act or not. This ability to believe that trauma recovery is realistic comes from the support of family, friends, and sometimes professionals. The best example I can give is a mother knows that smoking is harmful to her, let alone her fetus. She doesn't believe this because she persists in smoking during the pregnancy. A young adult is enjoying the night out and knows the best solution would be to take a taxi, but the brain doesn't believe that driving under the influence will do any harm to himself or others. The parent knows that vaccines are necessary to avoid serious illnesses, but avoids being vaccinated because they believe it won't impact them or their loved ones. These examples only touch the iceberg to give you an idea how the brain believing and knowing are coming from different systems of the brain. The dominant system of the brain is the emotional systems. The brain will predictably act on what it believes, consciously and most times unconsciously. When the brain is forced through intervention to believe something different, it can and will make innovative changes that are considered neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to adjust its connection or rewire itself. Without this ability, any brain, not just the human brain, would be unable to develop from infancy through to adulthood or recover from brain trauma caused by a physical or emotional event. Laura Sanders reported in the Science News October 4, 2021, that researchers found a patient's brain's biomarker that corresponded to the depression symptoms that the patient suffered. From there, they were able to interrupt the depressing symptoms with an electrical current about 300 times a day, which improved the patient's mood. The approach used by the University of California, San Francisco required intense imaging and sophisticated machine technology. A personalized implant was used to interrupt the brain waves and the emotional systems to ease the crushing symptoms of the patient's severe depression. She wrote that complexity may prevent it from being a wider treatment, cautions Helen Mayberg, a neurologist icon of medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. Still, the results, which add to a variety of ways to detect and change problematic brain activity, contain valuable information about how depression takes hold of a brain and how brain stimulation can change that. Says Mayberg, whose research has helped build and refine the field of deep brain stimulation for mood disorders. So depression is the function of the brain's emotional systems is impaired by trauma or deregulation of brain waves that disrupt the normal electrical waves of the brain. To ignore or treat depression as unimportant is to be willfully ignorant of how the brain and the body work in tandem. If I injure my body, I feel depressed and feel physical pain. If I sustain an emotional injury, I feel depressed and feel emotional pain. The brain registers pain, whether physical or emotional, in the same place in the brain. The only significance that needs to be noted here is the ability for the brain to process the depression. A deregulation of emotional brain activity that results in serious mental illness needs to be supported by professional intervention. This is no different than having professional intervention when I have a physical injury. The challenge is to have the confidence in your self-awareness to know when you need to see a professional for a physical or emotional injury. If you are unable to make that decision, then err on the side of safety and see a professional that you trust. In my private practice, I found that validating a person's depression symptoms was the first step in recovery. These strong feelings are not to be ignored, mitigated, or belittled. The strong feelings are the cause and the cure for the depression. Strong feelings can keep us alive, or they have the capacity to kill us. To think that emotions are out in the ether and are not tangible is to create vulnerability. To believe that you can control your feelings, again, is creating vulnerability. Your brain interprets all events through the emotional systems of the brain. Therefore, feelings are not in your control. You can manage them after you have processed them at a conscious level of awareness through the thinking systems of your brain, and then hopefully work on retraining your brain to believe what you have learned about yourself and your world. It is scientifically understood that if you can consciously find a positive in every negative thought you have, you can literally retrain the brain to feel confident again. It falls into that category of resilience. You are literally teaching your brain to be resilient. Happiness is a science contrary to our social media propaganda. That happiness is created by possessions and others' approval. Happiness is a conscious commitment to teaching the brain to be resilient to strong negative feelings. The retraining starts with self-talk. Self-talk is the brain's most essential tool in learning everything. Humans start to use this skill when they learn language. I believe that this is a unique part of being human and not just a coincidence. Self-talk is a skill, and it needs to be worked, honed, and developed. When I was working with clients who suffered from chronic depression that was not caused by emotional trauma, self-talk enabled them to work through the black periods and make confident decisions about using drugs to help with the debilitating periods of depression that they lived with. The use of self-talk is still extremely important. Self-talk is the most valuable and effective tool we have to learn and manage strong feelings. Understanding that the emotional systems of the brain are engaged before the thinking systems of the brain is important in self-talk. I may have a debate, and yes, even an argument with myself about processing the strong feelings that are sometimes knocking the stuffing out of me. But that articulation is valuable to the brain. Humans are social animals and are hardwired to belong to a social group. This primitive need will always dominate interactions throughout our lives. It is learning to understand at the conscious level what we are believing, thinking, and then know why we are behaving. When we do this, we bring the unconscious to the conscious level of understanding and knowing. Time is also critical in teaching the brain to be resilient when bombarded by strong negative feelings. It is important to always keep this in mind and to be gentle with ourselves when we are processing strong negative feelings. The brain needs time to process and manage the onslaught. It is important to not judge the time it takes to do this important work. It is also important to have family, friends, and if need be, professional help with the managing of the strong negative feelings. To do this alone is contrary to human needs. Unfortunately, our social propaganda dictates that we are wimps if you can't handle your feelings. If you buy into this crazy-making notion, you are vulnerable for the risk of failure. This belief is also supported by the crazy-making notion that others control our feelings. Not possible. No one can get into your brain and fire up the neurons necessary to have you feel angry, sad, happy, joy, etc. Because only you can feel these feelings. Now it is a matter of thinking through the feelings and making sure that the thinking systems of your brain are engaged. I use my 3-step model of self-communication that I designed to help build this skill. Knowing what you feel is more important than thinking about what you feel. Once you have the confidence to know what you are feeling, only then can you now act on those feelings. Simple but paradoxical. The irony is that we are not taught formally to identify our strong feelings and why we have them. We are not taught to understand the importance of those strong feelings, and this is where we get into trouble, with reacting to the strong feelings instead of responding by using the emotional and thinking systems of our brain through self-awareness.